There are a lot of names for a group in the Middle East that is currently at war with over 60 countries and is designated as a terrorist organization by 16 of those same countries. You've probably heard the term ISIS used in the news, which stands for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and you've probably heard Obama use the word ISIL, which means the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. IS, or the Islamic State, is what the group prefers to be called, and Daesh is what the group is referred to as in Arabic. But is ISIS a country? Is ISIS a state? ISIS has absolutely no international recognition of statehood by any country in the world, and yet they control an area somewhere around 30,000 square miles, govern a population of around 8 million people, have a capital, enforce Sharia Islamic law, collect taxes, and have an army of anywhere between 50,000 to 250,000 soldiers. But how did it get to this point? How did it get to the point to where the map of the Middle East has this blob called ISIS that just dominates huge swaths of Syrian and Iraqi territory today? Well, the first chapter in this story begins when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan way back in 1979. The Soviets invaded at the request of the then socialist government of Afghanistan, who were losing power rapidly to traditional Muslims inside the country. Muslims from all over the world flocked to Afghanistan to fight a guerrilla war against the Soviets and called themselves the Mujahideen. Many of them saw the war as a religious struggle between Islam and the atheist, godless Soviets. And among those Mujahideen that came to fight in Afghanistan were Osama bin Laden and a Jordanian named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. They both meet during the war, and almost right away they do not get along well due to al-Zarqawi's extreme views of killing other Muslims who to him he considered guilty of heresy. The war in Afghanistan goes on for 9 years until the Soviets eventually withdrew in 1989, and the foreign Mujahideen fighters eventually go back home as well. Osama bin Laden went home to Saudi Arabia, and al-Zarqawi went home to Jordan to start his own terror organization. Al-Zarqawi received $200,000 in funding from bin Laden to start his own organization, but it didn't really go anywhere. Meanwhile, bin Laden eventually is exiled from Saudi Arabia and moves back to Afghanistan with his organization now named Al-Qaeda. The Taliban now rules in Afghanistan and is friendly to his organization, and in September 2001 is when the next chapter of this story begins. On September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan launches the 9/11 attacks in the United States. The United States in response declares the global war on terror and invades Afghanistan, where al-Zarqawi returns to fight alongside the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But he gets injured and flees to Iraq to a hospital in Baghdad in 2002. And as fate would have it, the very next year while he was still in Iraq, the United States invaded the country and destroyed the regime of Saddam Hussein. Saddam's regime was dominated by the secular Ba'ath Party that was ruled by a majority of Sunnis. Going back to the ancient divide within Islam between the Sunni and Shia branches, Iraq was and is a very diverse country. Sunni Arabs are located primarily in the north, Shia Arabs in the south, and ethnic Kurds in the northeast. But remember how I said that the Ba'ath Party consisted of mostly Sunnis? Well, Sunnis are actually a minority in Iraq, making up 42% of the population, while the Shia make up 51%. This means that for decades under Saddam, the minority Sunnis were largely in power, and this will be important for later. So just about as soon as the American-led coalition destroyed the Ba'athist government in Iraq, the Ba'ath Party was outlawed in the country by the occupiers. Intended to be similar to the denazification process in post-war Germany, Iraq was to undergo a de-Baathification process. Anybody who was affiliated with the Ba'ath Party was barred and kept from working at any job in the public sector. As a consequence, it resulted in the disbanding of the Iraqi army because almost everybody in the army was a Ba'ath member. As for an unintended consequence, however, since the Ba'ath Party and the army were overwhelmingly Sunni in population, this meant that all of a sudden a disproportionate number of Sunnis in Iraq were left unemployed, barred from future employment with the government, and were left extremely resentful. Hundreds of thousands of former Iraqi soldiers and officers were left with their weapons and remained free, but were unable to find jobs and unable to support their families. At any point in human history where there has been an occupying force that changes the status quo or that causes a portion of the population to feel weakened without completely crushing them, an insurgency or an uprising is the inevitable and final result. Nazis in Germany, for example, were purged after 1945, but Nazi Germany was also completely, totally, and undoubtedly crushed in a 6-year-long war. Nazis also did not overwhelmingly represent one religious class within Germany the same way that the Ba'ath Party did in Iraq, and nor was Germany surrounded by fellow Nazi fanatics in other countries that would volunteer to fight against the occupiers. That ship had already sailed a long time ago. The Sunni government of Saddam had long oppressed the Shia inside the country, and now that the Sunnis were taken out of power, it meant that the Shia, sponsored by neighboring Shia Iran, would inevitably gain power. The Sunnis felt that they had totally lost their country to the Shia and to the influence of Iran. And to add even more fuel to the fire, many insurgents early on were imprisoned in a US-run facility called Camp Bucca where they were able to meet up and further radicalize together. It was these fundamental misunderstandings of how to handle the situation in Iraq after the war was won that created the conditions for the insurgency in Iraq to thrive. Believing it to be a new Afghanistan, jihadist Sunni groups from across the Middle East poured into Iraq to help fight against the occupation. This leads us to where we left off with al-Zarqawi. He creates another group in Iraq in this atmosphere of chaos, and this one rapidly gains momentum and becomes the most brutal of the jihadist factions within the country. The newly established Iraqi democracy elects a majority Shia government due to the majority of Shia inside Iraq. Remember that the Sunnis had been in power ever since Saddam took power in 1979. Feeling threatened by this new Shia-led government, al-Zarqawi's group begins to deliberately target Shias within the country for attacks. The aim was to provoke a Sunni-Shia civil war in the country that would hopefully bring the Sunni back into power again. Al-Qaeda began to take notice of this and formed an alliance with al-Zarqawi, so he changed the name of his group to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Zarqawi's fame became incredibly well known in Iraq, but finally in 2006 he was killed in a US airstrike. After his death, Al-Qaeda in Iraq began to fall apart and lost huge amounts of ground to the Americans. 5 years after al-Zarqawi's death in 2011, the United States and the occupying forces left Iraq in the hands of the new Shia-led democracy. Unfortunately, as another twist of fate, however, that was the exact same year that the Arab Spring began. We don't have time to go into how complex the Arab Spring was right now, but just understand that it stirred up long simmering tensions all across the Middle East. Most importantly for this story, it sparked riots in Syria that caused the dictator of that country, Bashar al-Assad, to crack down brutally. It led to a full-scale civil war in Syria when the rebels began to fight back against the government. After the use of chemical weapons by both sides and threats made by the United States to directly intervene against him,
and that is why, after careful deliberation, I determined that it is in the national security interests of the United States to respond to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike.
Bashar al-Assad released jihadis and radicals from prisons all across the country to taint the rebels with extremism in an effort to avoid this. For that reason or another, the United States ended up deciding not to directly attack his regime. And meanwhile, just across the border in Iraq was the shadow of what remained of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Sensing an opportunity in Syria early on into the chaotic civil war, the group began to cross the border from Iraq to fight. Syria, like the modern democratic Iraq, has a government that is dominated by the Shia. Bashar al-Assad is an Arab, Alawite, Shia Muslim, and his government is dominated by them despite how they only make up about 12% of the population of that country. Unlike Iraq though, Sunni Arabs are 60% of Syria's population and are a majority, but like Iraq, were feeling oppressed and disenfranchised by their Shia-led government. Al-Qaeda in Iraq sensed the opportunity to expand their territory and influence into Syria for this reason and intervened, thereafter rebranding itself the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. But this rebranding and intervention angered Al-Qaeda, who were already starting a group in Syria called the Al-Nusra Front. Al-Qaeda had wanted the Syrian and Iraqi groups to remain separate, and so the two groups began to actually fight one another. Al-Qaeda denounced ISIS and cut off all ties with the group shortly after the Syrian intervention. Led by a new leader by the name of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, ISIS became the first rebel group in Syria to capture major cities like Raqqa, which it made its de facto capital. But it was in the summer of 2014 when everyone began paying attention to it. In a blitzkrieg-like offensive into Iraq, ISIS captured the second largest city in Iraq named Mosul and got to the borders of Baghdad itself. It was a few weeks after this that ISIS renamed itself yet again to simply the Islamic State, or IS. Declaring themselves to be a caliphate, they demanded that all Muslims worldwide must pledge allegiance to them and announced their ultimate aim of conquering the entire Islamic world, which in their mind is from Spain to India. Many other groups around the world, like Boko Haram in Nigeria, have pledged allegiance to the group, and now they fly their flag. ISIS gained even further infamy by releasing brutal execution videos of civilians, journalists, and groups that they consider to be undesirable. After ISIS announced that they intended to commit a genocide against the Yazidi people, a religious minority inside Iraq, the United States restarted military operations in the country by bombing the group. After the group bombed a Russian passenger airliner, killing all 224 people on board, and after the attacks in Paris, which killed 129 people, ISIS has demonstrated their ability to strike outside of both Iraq and Syria, and thereby alarming the rest of the world. Currently being bombed by dozens of countries and facing a demoralized but resilient Iraqi army in the east, an emboldened Syrian army in the west, and the Kurdish forces in the north, ISIS is currently surrounded by enemies. But despite all that, they have seemingly been thriving. We'll just have to see what will happen in the future with them.